What's up guys, welcome to JR Strength and Fitness, your friendly YouTube channel with all of your exercise science needs, your reaction video wants, and of course some exercise tutorials, because why the hell not?
You can say hello, but I don't need you to.
In this video, I'm going to be doing a part 2 on the whole core training. If you haven't seen part 1, right up in there. Pretty much part 1 talked about what the core is, what structures the core, and how it's all integrated and why it's important to train the core. Not only for the back pains of the world, all the other sort of ailments that you probably see in training, but if you want to get stronger, if you want to get faster, you want to jump higher, core training. So it was essentially just a intro into core training, but in this part 2 we're going to be breaking down a little bit more of exercise selection for core training and essentially the methods behind core training, how to get the most out of it. So if you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe, let your friends know about me. We are about to get some video tutorials out too because gyms are finally open. Hallelujah. Anyway, I want to keep this real short because obviously last one wasn't quite that short, but hopefully this is just a real quick breakdown. Obviously this isn't going to be an entirely exercise science scope. Like I can literally break down the entire scientific biomechanical structures of the spine and how to train them, but we're just not going to talk about that. I'm going to focus really on the exercise selection and methodology behind the core training, or essentially how I do it. If you recall from part 1, we established that a lot of these deep core muscles are essentially stabilizing the spine and the pelvic area. So all these muscles have a role as far as stability goes. And then obviously it's integrated with all the bigger muscles, the ones that have a lot more movement involved in them. So everything is integrated, so that's how we're going to address it. I tend to place core exercises in 4 different categories. You can technically put them in 5, maybe even 6 categories, but I focus on the 4 just to keep things very simple. The first focus is anti-movement. So obviously stability requires controlled movement, and controlled movement can start with no movement, unwanted movement. So that rotation, that flexion that we talked about in the spine, all of that unwanted movement causes excess amount of shear force and compressive forces on the spine and can lead to injuries and all the other stuff. So if we can control movement, we can stop movement, then we can get into deliberate movement. So first area is non-movement. The first category is the anti-extension exercises. These are perhaps the most common exercises. These are your planks of the world, your hollow bodies of the world, your overhead movements of the world, anything that pretty much requires the trunk to stay rigid. Because extension is where I'm essentially leaning back, extending backwards at the spine. You know how you have that excess arch of the back, or if you're holding something overhead and you're gonna like arch your back hella, that's extension. So we want to keep this rigid posture where we're like a tree trunk. So that anti-extension is what those exercises do. So I remember growing up, our coaches had us holding planks, our coaches had us holding 6-inch holds, and we're pretty much just trying to hold on for dear life. But the caveat was that we actually had no idea how to actually do the exercises correctly. So here are we chilling, trying to hold a plank and our hips are sagging to the ground. Lo and behold, we are actually in extension, and lo and behold, we get into hyperextension where I'm like sagging all the way to the ground, but I'm still off the ground, right? But I want that tight, rigid position where my rib cages stay clamped down and tucked in. As soon as I flare those rib cages, now I've created that extension in the back. And that extension, now it's important to know that it is a spectrum. You can have a deviation, moderate deviation. Now, I know that I don't have as much extension as some other people. I know a lot of other athletes, specifically explosive athletes, jumpers, sprinters, they have a good amount of extension. Now, thing is being able to control it. So if there is an unwanted extension when you're doing some sort of like an overhead press or something, then that's going to compromise movement, that's going to compromise performance. And if it gets to the point where you're arching your back so much that you start to actually pinch the spine, that's going to be pretty darn bad. We don't have to get into the whole biomechanical science behind it, but let's just say you don't want to do that. The second area is your anti-rotation exercises. Now, I know the rotation's kind of a two-sided thing because we do want rotation, but before you get into deliberate movement, establish non-movement. Anti-rotation is essentially keeping your torso facing the same direction. So your thoracic spine, which is like the 12 vertebrae that are in the upper and middle back area, those are actually supposed to have rotation. A healthy dose of mobility is actually important for overall spine health. But your lumbar spine, the lower back, they're not supposed to rotate that much. If anything, you'll see numbers from anywhere from 5 degrees to 12 degrees of like rotation that's like allowed, but that's very dependent from person to person, depending on your sport, depending on what kind of training you do. Are you a rotation athlete? Do you play golf? Do you play baseball? Do you do all those other things? That will essentially dictate how much rotation you are allowed to have. But for your everyday person, you are not supposed to be rotating your lower back that much. It's just, it doesn't feel good too. You can just kind of feel the grinding. It just, anyway, we want an integrated unit when it comes to the core. So the thoracic spine all the way down through the hips are supposed to be stabilizing the spine and the pelvis. So a lot of exercises of anti-rotation are the very famous Palloff exercises. These are where you hold the band or cable out in front of you with whatever resistance or tension, and you're trying to keep it in front of you without rotating to the side. A very, very common anti-extension exercises. And I do these a lot, but any sort of movement that we're trying to keep our torso rigid. So imagine you're running and I'm running and my pelvis and my torso are just rotating back and forth all over the freaking place. It might not be causing like injury, but you are definitely laxing on the performance side of it. If I'm a sprinter, I don't want any movement this way. I want pure linear movement forward. Not really backward, but just forward. But for the most part, that rotation is unneeded and unwanted, and we're trying to control it. When it comes to the anti-rotation, the reason why you have anti-rotation is that you can learn how to deliberately create rotation. Like I said, the thoracic spine is supposed to have rotation, the lumbar spine is not supposed to have much rotation, and where you generate rotation. So if you're a baseball athlete, if you're a thrower, if you're any sort of athlete that has a lot of rotation, you want to be able to generate force through the hips. And when we talked about core training in part 1, we talked about if there is a leakage of energy because you have weak core, whatever it is, you are essentially just bleeding energy, and that a lot of these deeper core muscles, they transfer force. If you're transferring force from your hip through your torso when you throw something and you have a leakage because you have a weak core, well, now you're not going to get that full power output, but versus having a fully structured integrated unit to produce force. So that is why we train anti-rotation before we train rotation, and then we can get into rotation, no problem. All right, the third area is your anti-lateral flexion exercises. These are your side planks of the world, your unilateral exercises like the suitcase carries of the world, but all these exercises kind of just naturally will guide you into how to perform them correctly. If you hold a weight off the side, or actually, let's stay out of the gym for a second. You're going grocery shopping, right? And nowadays, because bags or whatever, you're carrying your own bag or you're carrying a bunch of bags and then you're holding it off this side. If you're holding it off to one side and you are like leaning over this way, that is lateral flexion. Anti-lateral flexion is keeping everything in a straight line, nice and rigid and neutral, and holding off this side. No matter how heavy it is, you're keeping it locked in and you're able to maintain that straight posture. As soon as you have this deviation, now we have unwanted of the spine. Now, is this necessarily going to create a lot of problems? You can argue no, you can argue yes, but for the most part, again, the same concept. You'll have a weak core, you are leaking energy, and we want the entire core to be integrated into one whole unit. Like I said, with the side plank, for example, you're holding that bridge and your obliques and your, hips even are working to keep you in a straight line. If they're weak, you're just going to sag down to the ground. So that one's pretty straightforward, and you know how a lot of people do that kind of side bend stuff? That is deliberate lateral flexion. Now, I'm not gonna get into the nitty gritty things of why that exercise is kind of pointless, But for the most part, we want this to be rigid. We don't want it to actually have that much movement. If you're looking for the burn, then go for it. I really don't care. Those were the main areas for non-movement oriented exercise selection. But when it comes to movement, you obviously led with the rotation from the anti-rotation exercises. So we are supposed to rotate, but in a controlled and deliberate manner. If you're doing Russian twist and you're just flopping around a weight or med ball, probably not the best idea. But if you're tall, in a tall posture, and you're rotating at the thoracic spine while the lumbar spine stays rigid and neutral, cool. That's rotation. That's rotation training right there, controlled and deliberate. If you're throwing around a med ball and you have a locked in lumbar spine, but you're generating power through the hip, through the torso, cool. That's rotation training right there. It's pretty straightforward once you kind of understand how they're all broken down into their categories. Okay, so the other area of the core that's actually important, why it's an integrated unit, is the actual movement of hip flexion, where we actually bring the legs up. So hip flexion is very crucial, especially for you sprinters out there, even any sort of like vastly hip dominant exercises like jumping, sprinting, those things. Hip flexion is definitely important. A lot of the talk about the hip flexors causing lower back pain has stemmed in the medical field as mostly they are super tight, in which case they can be super tight with non-movement. If I don't move my arm forever and I barely even move it, yeah, it's gonna be pretty freaking frozen. But for the most part, they're actually really weak. I tend to focus on strengthening the hip flexors. Obviously we can stretch them too, but stretch is only gonna go a long way. But the strengthening aspect of it, yeah, we want that hip flexion. We want a deliberate hip flexion. Obviously, if it's weak, if you don't have the right endurance for it, if you can't properly hip flex while doing a lunge or doing a squat or running or something like that, then something else is going to take the burden, and now we have a problem somewhere else on the chain. Deliberate hip marches, deliberate knee flexion, as far as just knee drives, high knees of the world, like mountain climbers, even like you, literally anything. But I would start with the isometrics of the world, the kind of like even just holding your leg up at that 90 degree, whether you're standing, whether you're lying down with a mini band around the feet, like just these simple marches of the world, just to get those hip flexors actually working. Because believe me, your everyday person doesn't actually use those muscles like ever. All right, and the last category is obviously just flexion. These are your crunches and sit-ups of the world. Like I said, they don't necessarily have much utility. They do have a lot of utility in the sports-oriented manner, in which case, if you are overhead throwing something, or you are like a volleyball hitter, or you are throwing in for soccer, or anything like that, that explosive exertion of flexion is definitely important. But like I said, it is a force transfer from the hip through the torso. So if you are trying to throw a ball as hard as you can, you are using your hips predominantly. If you are just bending at the spine, yeah, you're not gonna get much force out of that. The spine's just there to kind of transfer force, but it's not like we don't flex the spine. We need the spine to actually move. Healthy though, and controlled, not just flailing around with heavy weight trying to get that six-pack life. So if you're trying to get that tone ab kind of feel, then sure, a lot of hip flexion, a lot of spine flexion will probably be beneficial. But if you're trying to healthy back, sports performance, then we want anti-movement, and then we want to establish these movement-oriented exercises in a deliberate manner. All right, so when it comes to the mythology behind the whole core training, so obviously anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion, anti-rotation, these anti-movement and versus the movement-oriented exercises, they might train a little differently. So think about how we measure movement of an exercise. We have the eccentric portion, which is the lengthening of the muscle, either the lowering down or slowing down kind of feel, or the isometric, where there's no movement and we are holding tension, like a wall sit, for example. Or you have the concentric side, which is the applied movement, I like to put it. Anti-extension will come in movements in which we are resisting movement. You can integrate all these different aspects of non-movement exercises like the anti-extension world while doing a different movement. If you are doing some sort of overhead position, or even the ab wheels of the world, the ab rolls, or the dragon flags of the world, this is anti-extension in a controlled eccentric manner, because as the body is moving, you are actively trying to resist that extension. And so these muscles are working to resist that kind of movement. So if you've done a dragon flag before, it is brutal. I would say that the top exercises for your anti-extension exercises are the dragon flags of the world, the planks of the world, your ab wheels, any sort of plank where you're trying to keep that position. The hollow body is a fundamental gymnastics exercise for that specifically. The isometric part is pretty evident. You're not moving, you're just trying to hold tension. So obviously just holding a plank, holding a side plank, these are just holds, and you are trying to build endurance, local muscle endurance of these deeper core muscles and the movement in of itself. But I'm not gonna say like you're trying to hold a plank for minutes on end. Like, I know the record is like 8 hours. Believe me, you can do something a little bit more functional than holding a plank for as long as you can. And then the other side is the concentric side. So this is your applied movement. This is your, deliberate, hip flexion. This is your deliberate rotation, those kind of things. So all areas of core training incorporate those three aspects, and of course all the aspects of the anti-movement and the movement exercises. And the beauty behind it is that you can integrate it all over the place. You can have an anti-rotation with a lunge. You can have a deadlift with a anti-lateral flexion component. All of these different ways you can do this. So you can have an anti-extension component with a horizontal push kind of movement where you're holding a dead bug on the ground while pressing with dumbbells. You can integrate all of it. There is like an unlimited amount of ways you can possibly create exercises that incorporate these aspects. But the aspects are, like we said, anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion, anti-rotation, and then you have your movement, the rotation, the hip flexion, and of course, spinal flexion. Like I said, I was gonna try to keep it short, so hopefully I can, go a little bit deeper at some other time as far as the core training, because obviously this is an area in which I actually perform like daily and specialize in, so I can go a little bit deeper into it. But for the most part, we have a general understanding of how core training works. So again, please like and subscribe, let your friends know about me, and until next time.
You can say hello.